All right, y'all. So next we're going to be talking about FDR and something called the New Deal. Now, I mentioned with our last section of notes that 1932 was an election year for the presidency. And Herbert Hoover, as he's running for re-election in 1932, has realized that this economic depression isn't going anywhere. And he's going to try to sort of frame his candidacy for re-election around this idea that the worst is past. So he's basically trying to convince the American people that the worst parts of this economic downslide are past us and that we can move on and continue to improve our country in some of the ways that he's already done, like with the Hoover Dam. But then the other candidate, our Democratic candidate, is Franklin D. Roosevelt. And Roosevelt and his campaign is going to promise what he calls a New Deal for the American people. And much of his campaign is talking about helping out the forgotten man, meaning all the people that are unemployed, all the people that lost everything on the stock market that have been forgotten about for the past 3 years. Those are the people that his campaign is looking to help. So comparatively between Roosevelt and Hoover, Roosevelt's definitely appealing to a lot more people in 1932 than Hoover was. And we also have to keep in mind that Hoover's lack of response those first few years to the Great Depression is not going to play out favorably for him in the 1932 election. So if we look at the electoral map here, in 1932, you can see the popular vote. Roosevelt's going to win by over 7 million votes, but the electoral vote, the one that we actually use to determine the presidency, he wins by a landslide. He wins 89% of the electoral vote. And you can see there's only a handful of states there that Hoover won the electoral vote in. So Roosevelt in 1932 is definitively the new president of the United States. Now, what we see happen between when that election takes place in November of 1932 and when Roosevelt takes office in March of 1933 is we have what's called the Lameduck Period. And the Lameduck Period is basically saying that nothing was really happening. Hoover kind of feels defeated. He doesn't really do much after he loses that election in November. And the country's sort of stuck with 4 months of not really a whole lot going on from our president. Which a lot of people feel like is not very good, especially in a time of economic depression, that we need to have somebody who's going to help out our country, or at least if they're not going to help out the country, we don't need to be spending 4 months with them just sitting in office not doing anything. Which this sparks the passing of the 20th Amendment. The 20th Amendment to the Constitution actually changes when the president takes office. So it used to be before the 20th Amendment, they wouldn't take office until March. Now it is in January. So since the 20th Amendment was passed, presidential inauguration now happens in January, immediately following when the election takes place in November. And if you're curious and want to see a little bit more about Roosevelt's initial inaugural address, you can look at that link that's posted on this slide. Now, as far as FDR's presidency goes, the first 100 days of FDR's presidency are going to be very important, which pretty much since FDR's presidency, you can see a lot of presidents, when they start office, people will refer to their first 100 days in office, or they'll kind of separate the time that they're in office by the first 100 days, second 100 days, so on and so forth. But FDR's first 100 days, he's going to be doing a whole lot to try to revitalize our country's economy. He's working on stabilizing our banks and helping banks reopen one by one. He creates the FDIC, which we still have today. That's the organization that basically make sure that our banks are doing what they're supposed to do and that they're meeting federal guidelines. He's also going to order for all gold to be turned into our national treasury in exchange for paper currency. So he's moving us off of the gold standard, which this is going to be pretty big because we hadn't been off the gold standard previously. And this is also going to create some inflation, which inflation means that the value of our money is actually decreasing. And because people are turning in all of this gold for paper money, we just have all this paper money that's being printed and given out to people, which is why the value of the money will start to go down a little bit. But the idea is at least people have some money to be able to use and spend within our country's economy. And then also in his first 100 days, Roosevelt is going to encourage the passing of the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. The 21st Amendment will be the amendment that ends prohibition and overturns the 18th Amendment. And our 21st Amendment and 18th Amendment are the only two amendments to the Constitution that actually negate each other. Now, as far as these New Deal programs, because Roosevelt was promising a New Deal for the American people, we can kind of split all these programs up into three different categories. And those three categories are relief, recovery, and reform. Now, relief means we're specifically helping the groups of people and the organizations that were really hurt by the initial years of the Depression. So you can see a lot of these happen very early on in his presidency in 1933. But these are creating jobs for people who have been unemployed for possibly a few years now, making sure that we're helping out those that are most in need. That's what the relief category is. Now, the recovery category, that's looking at the big organizations, the things that were hit hard and have sort of crumbled since the stock market crashed and since our economy has been in this depression. Now, what we see here, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, Federal Housing Administration, our housing market was definitely in a rough spot at this point in time. So these organizations are going to be created to help kind of fix some of those issues that we saw happening within our housing part of our economy. And then as far as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, that's also meant to help out specifically the agricultural part of our economy, which in 1933, as the Dust Bowl is going on, we definitely are going to need some help there. And then the last category, reform, that is fixing some of the things that we saw within our economy that caused these things to happen in the first place. So the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, that was the act that helps create the FDIC to make sure that our banks aren't going to have something like what happened when the stock market crashed and people took all their money out of the bank and all of those things. It helps prevent those things from happening, which nowadays we can see these sorts of organizations are still around. Like we still have the FDIC or the Social Security Act. We still have Social Security. And these are things that started during the New Deal to help prevent these sorts of economic collapses from happening again. Now, as far as the New Deal goes, during this time, this was considered very experimental. These were brand new ideas within our government to see happening. So a lot of people aren't really sure what exactly is going to happen with this. Some people are going to be very skeptical, which we'll talk about here more in a minute. But these programs are very much going to be influenced by the ideas of the progressive era. So a lot of the backing for it comes from those progressive era programs and policies that we saw happening 15 years earlier. Now, those progressive ideas did end up being halted by World War I, and then we know throughout the 20s, we had our 3 Republican presidents through the 20s that were very hands-off when it came to economic issues. But these New Deal programs are definitely getting the government involved in our country's economy. And we see that with these programs, it's going to change that relationship between our government and the U.S. economy from this point on in our history. Now, as far as these programs go, they were very nuanced and people were sort of confused by a lot of them. They didn't really understand exactly everything that the programs had going on, especially because some of these programs were aimed to help individuals, whereas other programs were aimed to help companies and businesses. So people didn't exactly understand how they worked. Also, we have to keep in mind, a lot of them are brand new ideas that we've never really seen something like it before. So FDR, to kind of help explain these new programs, is going to start what's called the fireside chats. And these fireside chats were actually radio broadcasts that FDR would sit down and broadcast to the American people, explaining these programs. So people could sit down in their living room, turn on the radio, and in their own home, they could listen to the President of the United States telling them what exactly these programs are aimed to do and how these programs could help them, which this kind of helps make FDR a very relatable candidate and a very relatable president moving forward. Now, as far as the Depression as a whole goes, even though we do have a lot of these programs starting in 1933, we do see 33 is also when the Dust Bowl is going to hit the Midwest and our Great Plains region. So that's definitely bringing some more issues. And the unemployment rate will still remain high through the mid 1930s. So a lot of these programs, it will take some time for them to really start recovering things for our economy. But for FDR, he's also going to deal with a lot of opposition. People like Charles Coughlin, Huey Long, and Dr. Francis Townsend are all radical supporters of FDR's opponents. They're basically all saying that FDR as an individual is not somebody that the country should be putting their faith in. They call him a socialist. They basically say that all of these programs are expanding the power of our government and are not good for the American people. So basically, they're trying to say that we shouldn't be trusting these New Deal programs and that we should be pushing away these ideas, not embracing them with open arms. Now, typically, this would be a separate day of notes for us, but I'm just going to continue on going with the video so that way y'all can get all of our FDR New Deal stuff out of the way in one video. So going into 1936, we have another election that's going to take place. The Republican candidate is going to be Alfred Landon, who is very anti-New Deal and calls FDR a socialist, but Roosevelt, as the Democratic candidate, is going to win by a landslide. A lot of people really supported his New Deal programs and feel like his ideas are helping recover the economy. He's helping out the American people, so we need to stick with this New Deal. Now, the people that are supporting Roosevelt become known as the Roosevelt Coalition, which this coalition actually gets so strong in support and has so many supporters that it'll last well into the 20th century, even after FDR is no longer in office. So a lot of the supporters of FDR and the New Deal are going to be adamant supporters for years and years to come. Now, in this election in 1936, we can see again Roosevelt wins by a large margin in the popular vote, but then that electoral vote is even more of a win for him. He wins over 98% of the electoral vote, only losing 2 states in the electoral vote there. So definitely the American people really wanted to see Roosevelt in the presidency again in 1936. Now, as far as our political parties go during this time, because we haven't really talked about a whole lot of what our political parties have happening at this point in time, but the Democratic Party, because of FDR's New Deal programs, becomes a party for the vulnerable. So poor Americans, immigrants, farmers, Black Northerners, Catholics, Jews, white Southerners, basically anybody that could be considered a vulnerable group during the Great Depression, during the Dust Bowl, kind of was brought into the Democratic Party. Now, a lot of these people were, in some ways, already parts of the Democratic Party, but we do see the appeal of the party growing because of FDR. Especially among African Americans, we can see that appeal is increasing because FDR's programs are welcoming to these different groups of people. Now, it's not to say we don't still have a lot of race issues happening in the country. We definitely do. The Democratic Party itself definitely has a lot of race issues still going on. But a lot of people see these ideas that FDR is coming up with to help our economy and help out the average American people, that they really start to agree with those ideas and start to get brought into the party, which for the Republican Party, that means they're losing a lot of people, because pretty much since the end of the Civil War, through the Reconstruction era and since then, largely the Republican Party was the party of African Americans, because the Republican Party was the party that was the abolitionist party that was in support of our Reconstruction amendments. Typically, African Americans were members of the Republican Party. But then during the Great Depression, because of these New Deal programs, we can start to see that they're leaving the Republican Party in large numbers and joining the Democratic Party. We also see that the Republican Party is mostly going to be wealthy, Northern, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So we don't have a diverse group of people that are sticking with the Republican Party or that are members of the Republican Party during this time. Now, as far as FDR's programs go, while a lot of people do really support them and agree with them, we do start to beg the question of if these programs overstep the power of the presidency and if they're making our federal government too powerful. Now, what we see happen is there are going to be some legal battles that take place. 9 of FDR's programs are brought before the Supreme Court, and 7 of those programs are going to be found unconstitutional. So a lot of those will be rewritten to abide by the Constitution so they can continue to happen, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act was one of those. But we do see that there are definitely some constitutional questions being brought up with these programs. Now, Roosevelt tries to retaliate to this with something called his Pack the Court plan, which is basically the idea that he would just nominate more and more justices to the Supreme Court to fill the court with more people that would agree with his policies. This does not reflect very well on him. This is one of the few things during this time in his presidency that when people see him trying to put more justices on the Supreme Court just because he knows that they will agree with his policies, that doesn't really look well for him because that definitely is overstepping the power of the presidency. People do not like when he tries to do that. So once that plan fails, he kind of gives up on the idea of continuing forward with it because he realizes that's very unfavorable in the eyes of the American people. Now, as the Depression goes into the later years of the 1930s, 1938, 1939, we do see that a lot of the big struggles of the early 30s have sort of subsided, that things are starting to get a little bit better. Our economy's starting to recover. But the federal government is continuing to work some of these issues like unemployment, trying to fix some of those numbers that are still like the unemployment number was still very high. But we also see, even though some of our country's issues are starting to get a little bit better, that overseas we start to have some other issues going on. And our leaders within the country start to see some of these international issues looming that are going on in Europe and Asia. And that's some of the stuff that we'll be learning a little bit more about in our next unit.